Welcome to Tutorial 1, Background and Introduction to the Framework for Redevelopment of Former Service Stations in the Province of Ontario. This tutorial provides information about how the framework was developed, why it was developed, and what municipalities, property owners, and other stakeholders can expect to gain from using the framework. For additional information on how to use the framework, please refer to the other tutorial videos available on the framework website. For a number of years, both industry and government stakeholders from across Canada have emphasized the need for more effective guidance on how to address process barriers and successfully navigate the redevelopment of underutilized and abandoned service stations. There was a clear need for tools and mechanisms that would help stakeholders remediate and redevelop former service stations. This framework is based on the premise that a standardized approach to the redevelopment of former service stations, developed through a stakeholder consultation process, will accelerate service station redevelopment. Service stations, including gasoline stations, service garages, and petroleum hydrocarbon bulk facility sites, are the most common type of brownfield site found across Canada and are usually highly visible, located along main roads and intersections. The basic process for the remediation of these sites is perceived to be a relatively straightforward activity, and yet many sites still remain undeveloped. One of the main challenges involved in redeveloping former service stations is how to create site value. Conventional petroleum hydrocarbon contamination cleanups for these sites, such as dig and dump, can typically range in the cost from $75,000 to $125,000, while the land values, especially in rural areas, can be as low as $25,000 per hectare. As a result of these slim margins, process barriers and associated delays represent a significant risk for developers. In order to reduce this risk and encourage redevelopment of former service stations, the Ontario Centre for Environmental Technology Advancement collaborated with the Province of Ontario and the Canadian Petroleum Products Institute to develop a framework that would provide effective guidance on redeveloping former service stations. The Ontario pilot of the framework was to be developed using input from a variety of stakeholders and would provide a user-friendly, common language tool that offered a standardized, streamlined, and transparent process to redevelop former service stations. The framework would be divided into the different stages of redevelopment and would include guiding principles, best practices, examples and case studies, tools, and a glossary. The framework was developed in 3 phases. Phase 1 focused on developing a research compendium and resource list to identify existing tools, resources, programs, and legislation. Once this information was gathered, the scope of the framework was decided upon. For example, it was determined that the framework should fit within the existing regulatory regime, use tools and flowcharts to help illustrate the process, use non-technical terms, emphasize risk-based protection and management, focus on existing technologies, and be flexible and adaptable. Funding support for this phase was provided by the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, the Canadian Petroleum Products Institute, and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. Phase 2 of the project covered the development of the framework. The framework was developed through a multi-stakeholder interdisciplinary team that took advantage of expertise from both the public and private sector. Stakeholders engaged in open and candid discussions to identify guiding principles, best practices, and solutions for streamlining the process of redeveloping former service stations. The team wanted to ensure that the framework was created using existing information, models, templates, and tools in non-technical language, and attempted to identify new information that is currently being developed as well as gaps or areas that required clarification. The framework focuses on typical service stations. In Ontario, it is estimated that approximately 80% of all underutilized and abandoned service stations requiring remediation and redevelopment fall under this definition of typical. A typical service station is one where the source of contamination is underground storage tanks, distribution piping and dispensing systems, or waste oil tanks. The main contaminants of concern are petroleum hydrocarbons, benzene, toluene, ethyl benzene, xylene, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Typical service stations are small in size with less than 2,000 tons of impacted soil and are adjacent to major roadways, intersections, or other service stations. Soil conditions may include weathered or soil-like bedrock, impacted groundwater, minor free-phase product, soil vapor intrusion, and off-site migration of contaminants to utility corridors and rights-of-way. MTBE, DIPE, metals, and lead scavengers may be found at levels below generic standards. Former service station sites where there is complex hydrogeology, contamination in competent fractured bedrock, or where there is a potential for recontamination from an off-site source are not considered typical. The framework is a valuable tool for anyone involved in the redevelopment of former service station sites. Available as a free online resource, the framework provides a streamlined and transparent approach to redevelopment. It will help stakeholders understand the importance of early and ongoing communication and promote understanding of how finance, technical issues, land use planning, and external communication interact. The framework also includes a set of guiding principles and best practices which highlight the important considerations for successful redevelopment described in the framework. The framework helps municipalities gain a better understanding of how property owner and developer requirements fit within the planning approval process. Municipalities can use this knowledge to create a more predictable and timely approval process. The framework also assists municipalities in encouraging the redevelopment of former service stations by providing guidance on streamlining the approval process, developing relationships with property owners and developers, providing effective incentives, and improving the development potential of sites. The framework provides property owners and developers with a streamlined and transparent approach for working with municipalities. It can reduce approval delays by addressing common misunderstandings between municipalities and developers, such as when the municipality can request a record of site condition. The framework provides guidance on how the redevelopment potential of former service station sites can be improved through the use of incentives and property-specific standards. It also provides clarification on the provincial approval process for remediation and risk management. The framework also provides a number of benefits to the province. By improving communication between stakeholders, identifying common problems, and providing guidance, the framework addresses a number of regulatory barriers while still operating within the existing regulatory framework. The framework identified key issues, best practices, and gaps to help the province facilitate the redevelopment of former service stations across Ontario. Through the use of this framework, municipalities, property owners, and developers will be able to accelerate the redevelopment of former service stations in Ontario. For information on how to use the framework, please refer to Tutorial 2, Getting Started, available on the framework website.